Okay, you have a genre picked and characters created. You have an adventure in mind and the players are at the table. Now what? Hey everyone, I'm Chris Norman, and this is my advice on how to run a GURPS game. The previous video was about how to set up a game, and I'm going to skip over building powers for now. In my mind, it's one of the cooler features of GURPS, but it's an added level of complexity that you don't need to get started. As I mentioned, you can select a small subset of advantages to allow and let your players use those. As everyone gets used to the system, you can introduce more advantages, and then the ability to apply enhancements and limitations to those advantages. Don't worry, I'll likely make a bunch more videos about that. But for now, let's talk gameplay. In their simplest form, most RPGs have two modes, combat and role-playing. When in combat, time is regimented, actions are limited, and everything happens in an order. And role-playing is, well, everything else. Let's tackle combat first. Unless your genre has literally no combat situations, and never will, you'll need to determine what level of combat you want to use. As the combat video suggests, you can start out with a minimal set of options and grow from there. This might be a good time to run a few example combats with the characters that you created and some NPCs. When I first started, I looked online for various combat examples and found the ones on themook.net. And they seemed understandable enough, but I just had a hard time getting my head around how it all worked. So I ran a few myself, and that really helped. It really hammered home the idea that each round is only 1 second. I was so used to larger combat rounds, I was feeling frustrated that I didn't seem to get enough done each round. But as I executed more rounds, it all started to make sense. I plan to make some combat example videos someday, mainly as an introduction to my players so they can see the breadth of actions possible. You may want to indoctrinate your players to the 1 second rounds by printing out a list of approved maneuvers, handing them out to everyone, and when it's their character's turn, give them 10 seconds to pick an action. Alright, maybe 10 seconds is a little too much, but pick something reasonable for your group. And really try to impress on your players that they should have their maneuver ready. It isn't as bad as you might think, since they're really only picking from a list of 5 or 10 things. Combat in GURPS is different from other systems. Great things are done in little steps. Seating in turn order sequence around the table helps, since the players would easily know when their turn is coming up. And as for your first few combats, you might start with a really small list of maneuvers, and after they've gotten the hang of it, increase the list to include more. No need to start with a huge list of maneuvers right away. If I were starting today, I would choose Ready, Concentrate, Aim, Move, Attack, and Heroic Charge, which costs 1 fatigue point. I'm actually skipping over the Move and Attack maneuver, which we had nicknamed Charge Attack, to get to the good stuff. I thought about it a lot after I made the combat video, and yeah, I would definitely add Heroic Charge as one of the first maneuvers to teach. It's just so useful, and it introduces the use of fatigue points. Now that players know they can use fatigue points, I'd also allow them to pay 1 fatigue point to add 2 points of damage to an attack, or a +2 modifier to their defense roll, at any time. Yes, officially you're supposed to pay the cost before you roll, but this is a game, and it's my game, and I want my players to have just a bit more control with their characters. So if someone misses their dodge roll by 1 or 2, they could spend a fatigue point to feverishly dodge. And if someone does a decent hit and it looks like they're really going to blow past the opponent's armor, they can have a burst of strength to add 2 more points of melee damage. I think this will give the players enough choices to make combat interesting, without being overly complex. But hey, you do you. This is the beauty of GURPS. This is how I'm arranging my toolkit of rules. You might want to do it a different way. Finally, in GURPS combat, remember that you don't die at 0 hit points. If you get to 0 hit points or less, you need to make a health roll to see if you stay conscious. And you'd only truly die when you get to -5 times your HP. But if you wanted to be a bit more lenient, you could instead say that the player needed to make the health roll to see if they had the stamina to do an action this round instead of remaining conscious. Remember, you're the game designer of your own game. GURPS provides a realistic baseline of rules, but you can adjust them however you want. Once you have combat figured out, then role-playing is easy. No, seriously, with the help of the wing it rule, you can handle any situation. Let me give you an example. I had a combat where there was a lower level, and then a small cliff, maybe 10 feet high, and then an upper plateau. One of the players had climbing skill and wanted to climb up the back of the cliff to surprise the opponent at the top. I used the wing it rule to say, okay, roll your climbing skill. If you critically succeed, then you make it to the top this round and even get a chance to do a ready action. If you just succeed, then you make it to the top. If you fail, then you have to spend the whole round climbing and you'll be at the top next turn. And if you critically fail, you'll fall, but you'll have a chance to catch yourself. While I was handling the following player's turn, the first player was looking up the specific rules for climbing in the basic set. He was going to do that action next round, so it hadn't happened yet, and he found them. GURPS climbing rules are very realistic. On a mountainside, you can move up 1/2 a foot per round. And I looked at him and said, nah, we're going to use my ruling, because it's more fun and more cinematic. And we went from there. He was able to utilize the skill that he'd purchased, and it even worked better than he expected. Everybody was happy. So don't be afraid to override a GURPS rule. It's your game. But what if you don't really know what skill to apply, or you can't remember what skills your player characters have? Well, you can use this trick. When you present a situation, ask the players what skills they have that they think would be most applicable. Let's say the party has come up to a locked steel door and they need to get through quickly. Normally you would think lockpick skill, but maybe nobody has lockpick skill. So you ask the players, do you have a skill that you think you could use in this situation? And you see what your players offer you. Somebody might come back with some kind of engineering or mechanical skill, and they'd explain how they'd use that to try to jimmy the lock open. Fantastic. You're getting your players involved, and they're looking over their character sheets to see what skills they have, if any, but everybody's engaged. Another trick I use is to tell the players to make a roll and just tell me the margin of success. I don't tell them the modifier beforehand. I do this for 2 reasons. One, if I told them that they could open the door with an engineering skill, but at a -6, you would set up in everyone's mind that there are 2 outcomes. They could either succeed or fail. And I might not want it to be a binary outcome. Maybe I would much rather describe it to them in thematic terms. And secondly, it allows me to fudge the modifier. So let's say I originally assigned a -6 in my head, but didn't tell them, and they roll. They have a skill of 10 and roll a 5, which is a pretty good roll. It's 1 point away from being a critical success. But officially, with the -6, it would have failed. Yet everybody's sitting around the table and sees that incredibly good roll, and so I fudge it. I say they succeed, and maybe it takes an extra round, or slightly damages the door, or something else minorly negative. The players get their success, and no one's the wiser. Or maybe I don't know a good modifier yet, and I wait to see what they roll. If they succeed by a huge amount or have a critical success, I could just allow it to pass. Or if they critically fail, no need to figure out an exact modifier. Nobody ever succeeds on a critical failure. But I do it both ways, depending on the situation. If it is truly a binary outcome, like did you hit or not, then I tell them the modifier beforehand, and they can see for themselves if they succeed. If the outcome is linear, I usually don't tell them the modifier up front, and gauge my response based on how well they do. Now, someone might come up with a crazy solution. Maybe they want to apply their underwater basket weaving skill to try to open the door. Of course, in the real world, this just wouldn't have a chance, but you could let them roll it, and have them tell you the margin of success. So instead of saying, no, that's not possible, just allow them to roll. And if they crit, then you get to flex your creative muscles to try to come up with a reason why it would have worked. I would probably say something like, you have a flash of a memory of you sitting at your grandmother's knee as she's weaving an intricate pattern into a basket. She looks at you and whispers, our family is old and once had great power, and you will find the power here, as she touches a spot on the pattern. You lean in to try to see better, and you notice that the vision overlays the outline of the door, and the tool marks and the scratches on the door seem to fit the pattern on the basket. You reach out and touch the spot that your grandmother touched, and your finger passes through the vision and touches the door, and you hear a click. As the vision fades, you see your grandmother wink at you and smile. The vision is gone, and the door is slowly and silently swinging open. Sure, it's not as epic as defeating the final boss with a stab to the eye, but your players will still talk about it for a while. Remember that time you opened the door by using your underwater basket weaving skill? Hopefully you can see why I've always maintained that running GURPS is easy. It's not a lot of rules, or should I say, you only have to worry about the rules that you want to worry about, and wing it for the rest. One final issue on gameplay. As I mentioned in the combat video, GURPS can be pretty realistic, and your group may not want that. Personally, I don't. I like GURPS realism, but I don't like being punished too harshly when I screw up. Heck, I have enough stress in my life. Notice the lack of hair. So besides some of the tricks I mentioned in the combat video, we also use story points. This idea seems to have evolved from the impulse buys of GURPS Power Up 5, but honestly, I can't remember where we found it. At the start of each session, each player is given 3 story points. The player can spend a story point to retroactively invoke luck, where they can re-roll 2 more times and take whichever result works best for them. Or they can declare that one cause of injury is a flesh wound, and reduce the hit point loss to 1. The character has a vision of the opponent's bloody sword chopping through their arm, and then shakes their head. The vision clears, and it turns out to just be a flesh wound.
How about you? You are indeed brave tonight, but the fight is mine.
Oh, had enough, eh?
Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left.
Yes, I have.
Look!
Just a flesh wound.
The idea is to give the player a way to fix a mistake they made, up to 3 times a session. Sometimes we don't use them at all, and other times we make so many mistakes, we end the night with 0 story points and barely any hit points left. I like story points because they remind the player, yeah, you messed up, but here's this lifeline to get you out of it. Power Ups 5 actually uses character points instead of story points, I think. But that seems a little bit harsh for our group. Nobody liked being penalized character points for making a mistake. But hey, your group may be different. In any case, it's a nice way to buffer your gameplay from GURPS realism and harsh punishments. Okay, if that's a bit too much flexibility, you could hand out nudge points. And I just made this up while I was working on this script, honestly. But instead of a whole re-roll, a nudge point could be spent if the player misses a roll by 1. Just 1. And you can't spend multiple nudge points on a single roll. Or you can, you're the GM, I don't care. Or you can hand out both, story points and nudge points. You can tell I take this whole GURPS is a toolkit thing to heart. I enjoy tweaking the rules just a bit to personalize my game, and hopefully make it more fun for my players. I love realism, but I love having a good time more. So now you start role-playing. Use the wing it rule as often as you need. Maybe your players will help you out and look up a rule that they plan to use so you don't have to go searching for it yourself. But don't be afraid to ignore the GURPS rules as written, just like I did for that one climbing roll. Just remember, GURPS has been extensively researched, and if it weren't for that cinematic combat situation, I probably would have followed the official GURPS rules. It just seemed so cool to do it my way, and for that one time. The last thing I want to leave you with is the 3d6 dice distribution. If you're used to a linear dice roll, d20 or d100, then knowing the percentage chance of a 3d6 roll can be helpful. If you ask someone to make a roll of 10 or less, that's a 50% chance. A 9 or less is 37.5% chance, and an 11 or less is 62% chance. You get the picture. An 18 is always a critical failure. And a 17 is a failure, but if your effective skill is 15 or less, then it's a critical failure. Also, any roll 10 or more than the effective skill is a critical failure. Your effective skill level is just the level you're going to roll against after all modifiers. So if you have a weapon skill of 17, but the GM has assigned you a -2 modifier because you're fighting in low light, then your effective skill level is 15. If your skill level or attribute is 12 and the GM assigns you a -8 modifier, then your effective level is 4. So if you rolled a 14 or more, then it's a critical failure instead of just a failure. A roll of 3 or 4 is a critical success, and there's a 1.852% chance of that happening. Unless your effective skill is 15, then you get a critical success on a 3, 4, or 5, which is a 4.63% chance. And if your effective skill is 16 or more, then you crit on a 3 through 6, a 9.259% chance. So there's a little more variation than just crit fail 5% and crit succeed 5%. Basically, it rewards trying to get your effective skill to 16, so you have an almost 10% chance of a critical success. And it punishes you a bit more if you try a really low probability check. Yeah, it may seem a bit fiddly, but it isn't really hard to learn. Of course, you don't need to do that. You could just say that an 18 is a crit failure, a 17 is a failure, and 3 or 4 is a crit success. But as with everything in GURPS, if you're willing to add the extra fiddliness, it adds a nice bit of realism. And finally, some don'ts. I wouldn't play with shock to start with. Shock occurs if a character, who doesn't have the high pain threshold advantage, takes damage in a round. The next round, the character is at a minus to roll anything based on Dex or IQ, except active defenses. It's a bit of a pain to keep track of, unless you're running in the Foundry game system. And you can start a death spiral, where your players start to take damage, become less effective, take more damage, and round and round. The same goes for the rule about being below 1/3 hit points, where your move and dodge are halved, round up, or 1/3 fatigue points, which is half move, dodge, and strength. Very realistic and not worth it, in my opinion, for a starting game. I don't like penalizing players twice for a mistake. First losing hit points, and then losing move and dodge. GURPS has a huge amount of rules for combat and injury, and you're welcome to use them or not. If you want to use the rules for crippling limbs, go right ahead. Just remember, it's not required. Also, don't overwhelm a small party with a lot of opponents. Due to the bounded accuracy built into GURPS, where power doesn't ramp up as much with increased experience, a larger party will have more actions than a smaller one. So a group of 10 orcs would get 10 attempts to crit a party of 2. Of course, you don't have to allow crits for NPCs, and there are other ways to mitigate the risks. But in general, I suggest keeping your first encounters small, especially if your group is new to GURPS. Get your feet wet in combat before jumping into the deep end. Hopefully, this gives you some useful ideas on what to do while playing. Really, the hard part was making the characters in the first place. Once they've been created, it's basically all downhill from there. And hopefully it's a fun ride. Again, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them all, and future viewers might use them as an FAQ. And as always, thank you for watching.